we really need to have a scenario where the French win decisively, which is possible with a few minor changes.
The French think they're entering a battle here. If you're a noble, okay, you're going to get ransomed, you're not going to get killed, okay? The English are in the killing business here. They can't afford to be too choosy about who they're capturing.
Yeoman archers, knights, men-at-arms, so forth, including my 17th or 18th great-grandfather, who's actually in this army, recorded on the Agincourt roll as a yeoman archer. Wow. Apparently a little bit of a miscreant according to the records.
So you've gone up in the world?
Yeah, just a little bit.
In terms of what's happening in England, Henry's been totally delegitimised, and so is his dynasty at this point, because God has actually spoken on the battlefield.
But in this scenario, yes, okay, it's a century down the line, a lot of can happen in between, but it's entirely possible that a much more maritime-looking England in the late 1400s goes, you know what, actually, yeah, let's see what's out there. Let's see if we can get better trade routes.
It's the 25th of October, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, and a small stretch of land in northern France is about to have its name put into legend. Agincourt, a battle that saw Henry V reignite the 100 Years' War, decimating the French nobility in the process, and eventually leading to his son taking the country's throne. It became one of England's greatest military victories, and Agincourt's legacy still lives on, doesn't it, 610 years later. Yet, should it have been this way? The English were heavily outnumbered by thousands on the day, and had the French not floundered in the deep, muddy ground, had their command been better disciplined, could the subsequent map of Europe have looked very different? I'm Daryl Morris, this is Times Radio History, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts we ask whether those split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, the Battle of Agincourt, a legendary victory over the French that legitimised Henry V's place on the English throne and beyond. Yet, what if the timeline of this crushing defeat was altered and actually it had been the French who had won out that day? These are the questions for our experts. And joining me today, as ever, is the historian and the author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and returning to the channel in a full suit of 15th century English armour, no less, is the historian and the YouTuber, Drachinifel. Drac, welcome. Hello. Look at this. How about that?
Yeah, it's fun, isn't it?
Oh, fantastic. It's so lovely to have you here. There's only one place we can start, isn't there? What a suit. So talk me through it. What are you wearing?
Right, so this is Agincourt period English plate armour. It's a little bit distinct from other plate armours at the time because obviously you associate this kind of armour mostly with knights. Knights are of course on horseback, but during the 100 Years' War up to this point, and as we'll see at Agincourt itself, the English knights have started fighting a lot more dismounted and on foot. And their armour has adapted to service that, because obviously if you're up on a horse, you're nice and up high, you don't really need to raise your arms above your head that much. You're first with a lance and then a shield, possibly hitting down at people. Whereas if you're on foot, you do have to block blows from up high. So here we have our spalders. Some people will call them pauldrons, but spalders is more accurate. And these are a lot smaller than what you might typically associate with knightly armour of the period. And that's so that I can do this. Yeah. And if I had a sword, I can block high, I can strike nice and easily. And one of the other features, which you can't see here, is down at my legs, I actually have plate all the way around my legs, all the way up. Whereas obviously on a horse, you tend not to have that armour at the back of your thighs because you need to control the horse. But if that area is relatively unprotected, then someone with a bill hook or some other kind of hook device can just reach around on foot and drag you down and hamstring you, which isn't great. Other than that, things like the hound skull bassinet is fairly standard across Europe. It's designed to deflect blows coming in from the front. My great bassinet, as you can see, is shaped to deflect blows coming down from on top. I've got a nice solid breastplate. My shoulders are protected by this double layering of padded coif and mail, because obviously for mobility underneath there isn't that much. Now, if I was wearing absolute full protection, I would also have mail here and here and here. But there are plenty of historical sources that show that there were knights who had that, but there were also knights who forewent that in order to gain even more mobility, right, which obviously in a hand-to-hand melee combat, especially if you're outnumbered, can be quite important at the expense of potentially some vulnerability.
Yeah. And how does it actually feel to wear?
Well, armour has to be shaped to the wearer. If you just take on generic armour, it will be very tiring very quickly, because even being out an inch or two and suddenly you're basically lifting the armour every time you move. Whereas if it's shaped exactly to you, it will move with you, it will restrict your movements when needed. So, for example, it's impossible to break my elbow joint because the armour will lock up at that point of extension. And contrary to some of the more popular myths that you see out there, you can run, you can fall over, you can get up, you can roll, you can fight, you could even dance, even if you want to sound like a factory falling down around your ears. So it's a very practical thing. It's not quite as protective as jousting armour, because jousting armour just has one thing to do, you go straight ahead. Whereas this, I have to take into account, I could be attacked from ahead, behind, multiple people, left, right, etc. So I need that extra mobility. So I need, for example, to be able to turn my head so I can see where the enemy is coming from. So this is a very practical foot combat armour, and it's very typical of what knights at Agincourt would have been wearing, with the sole exception, of course, that, as everyone can see, I'm nice and shiny, and as we can see in the background, a lot of them would have been wearing surcoats with their coats of arms to tell everybody who they are, because obviously if you have thousands of people looking vaguely like this, you don't know who's on whose side or who people are, and that can be very important.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Okay, well, so we'll come on to that in a minute, and the role that it's played. Chris, nice shirts, nice jacket that you've worn today. Do you want to talk us through your outfit?
Yeah, I feel a bit underdressed actually today.
Me too. Listen, you cannot possibly do this whole programme with that head on, right?
It is getting a bit warm.
Yes, I can imagine it is. We'll give you a set to take it off. In the meantime, Chris, take us into how this all plays out. Once more onto the breach, dear friend. Henry V on his way to France. Why?
Well, this is the second part of the 100 Years' War. It started in 1338. It's a dynastic dispute between Edward III in those days and the French. Edward says, look, I'm the legitimate heir to the French throne, so I should have it. They then fight a number of battles, Crécy, Poitiers, very famous. It ends in the sort of Treaty of Bretigny in 1360. And what we see then is the English ending up really controlling Aquitaine, which is down by Bordeaux, and a big area around there. They've got Calais here, but by and large, the French have recovered quite a lot of the territory that they had beforehand. Now, what happens in 1399 is Richard II of England is overthrown, and Henry IV, a Lancastrian, the Duke of Lancaster, takes over. And essentially, he has real problems with his legitimacy. He has over 8 revolts during the course of his reign. Henry V comes to the throne in 1413, and there's a suggestion that he needs to legitimise his throne because his father was a usurper. There's also a suggestion that if you actually externalise your internal problems by invading France, you might actually sort of unite the country. There's another issue as well. He says, look, we're not really happy with the settlement from the Treaty of Bretigny. There's a number of bits of land, dukedoms, that actually I really should have by right. And what he's trying to do is say to the French, I want to marry the king's daughter, that's the first thing. I also want 1,600,000 crowns in compensation. I'd also like a couple of these dukedoms back. And at that point, he's basically trying to coerce the French into extending the territory he's got. Now, what's going on in France at the time is essentially a sort of proto-Wars of the Roses for the French, and that is between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Again, it's a dynastic dispute between essentially the relatives of the Duke of Burgundy and also a faction called the Armagnacs around the French crown. And that's been going on again during the time of Henry IV in England, during the reign of Charles VI. Charles VI of France, who goes in and out of madness all the time. He starts off very well indeed, but suddenly he slips into madness as he gets older. So there's a constant sort of tussle between these two factions. Now, during Henry IV's reign, the English have got involved in this, and they send several expeditions to France, notably to Brittany and also down here in Gascony, in Aquitaine as well. And so everything's set for a three-cornered sort of dispute between these factions. And what happens is that Henry, when he comes to the throne, says, look, we are going to go to France. We are going to put some pressure on the French to see if we can get some more land. But maybe we'll also say we're coming to resuscitate the claims that we had in terms of Edward III. And actually, I might go for the throne. Now, my own view is that that is a coercive device at that point. because I think he's after, as I said, the 1.6 million French crowns and some bit of land around the edges of Aquitaine. But in the end, what he does, he gets 12,000 troops together. He musters at Southampton and Porchester Castle. Everybody thinks it takes place in Southampton. It's not. It's Porchester, near Portsmouth. And he takes a fleet across to Harfleur. And he captures Harfleur. He goes in August, takes a month to capture it, which is a bit long, really, because he's now getting out of the campaigning season. Now, that 12,000 is probably diminished to about 8,000 because of disease, dysentery, and obviously they've taken some casualties at Harfleur as well. So quite a few of his nobles, including his brother Thomas of Clarence, and also a number of others, go back because they've got dysentery or they're injured. And at that point, and nobody's really sorted out why he does it, he decides, instead of actually re-embarking himself, he needs to get something out of this campaign. So he decides he's going to march northeast and go to Calais.
Right.
And that's the decision that really sets this in train. And the French, obviously seeing this, they wanted to relieve Harfleur but couldn't get the forces together.
Yeah.
They're based in Rouen, the capital of Normandy, and they have a plan.
Okay. ... Drac, just before we get to that, any indication as to why he wanted to go to Calais? What do we know about that decision?
Right, so Calais at this point is an English-held stronghold. It has been for ages. It will be up until the reign of Mary I in the Tudor period. The problem that Henry faces, as Dr. Parry quite rightly pointed out, is that Harfleur takes far longer to fall than Henry plans. The French defenders of Harfleur do a brilliant job, and in fact, they only end up giving up when it becomes very clear that reinforcements aren't coming. And the final arrangement is actually essentially them saying, look, if the reinforcements haven't shown up by a certain time, we'll give in, but until then, we're going to resist. So once he's captured Harfleur, it's now quite late in time. His fleet, because bear in mind, all of this is being funded privately by the crown. There's no such thing as a kind of a state coffer at this point, apart from his personal ones. The large fleet he's brought over has had to disperse, partly because it costs a lot to run, and partly because also, until Harfleur falls, there isn't really any suitable anchorage in this area for them to ride out for weeks and weeks and weeks. So he has no immediate transport home, and now the French are beginning to get underway. And given that he's mortgaged his crown jewels, he's invested a huge amount of money and a good chunk of England's fighting power into this campaign. If he then sits there, sends a few messages back, gets picked up, comes back after Harfleur, and the whole thing's just been to capture one port, that's not really going to sit very well with anybody back at home. And so he needs to do something else to show not only that he's got some results for it, but also to show a degree of dominance over the French, because the whole thing is very much a propaganda and political ploy as much as a military one. So during his time at Harfleur, he's been sending messages to Rouen, to the Dauphin, and basically saying, look, we're both good Christian monarchs. We know we probably shouldn't really be killing each other. That's for the Crusades against infidels and so forth. So how about we settle this one-on-one, trial by combat? God will decide who's right. And the Dauphin reasonably sensibly concludes he's probably not going to win a one-on-one against Henry V and just refuses to answer. But from a propaganda perspective, Henry can say, look, I've tried to do everything in my power to reduce casualties and to show that I'm doing this the proper way. It's the French's fault that we're still having this war. And so part of this march is also a case of, well, look, all you French people, I'm claiming to be your rightful lord. I should be the Duke of Normandy, because of course that's been passed down from William the Conqueror, although the French have physically retaken the area. And part of it is what is sometimes called a chevauchée, which is basically an armed march through the area to show, look, I can march through this place with my army. No one can stop me. If I wanted to, I could burn everything and kill everyone. I'm not, because I'm a generous lord. Right. You should all serve me.
Right. Okay.
And that is a repeat of Poitiers. Yeah. That is what the Black Prince did when he actually did a chevauchée right into the centre of the French land. And of course, you had the capture of the French king as well.
Okay. So he embarks on this journey to Calais, inland around the Somme. There's a French plan here at this point, isn't there, developing, Chris?
Yeah.
Go on, give us a sense of what that is.
Essentially, the French have decided they're going to dog his heels. They're not going to bring their main battle force to bear until, A, they think the English army is sufficiently weakened. They also want to pin the English army this side of the Somme. That's the key point. They're gathering forces from quite considerable distances, from Brittany, from Burgundy, funnily enough. Some of the Burgundian royal family are going to get involved. But there's a real rush by the French nobility to get involved. And this is part of the problem. There's competition to say, look, we need to be involved in this fight. It's going to be the event of the early 15th century, and we need to be involved.
To sort of shore up their position?
No, simply for prestige.
Prestige?
And, and if you're a knight, if you're a duke, this is glory. This is ransoms as well.
Yeah.
We can get ransoms from the English. All their nobility are there. But this is Premier League stuff. So everybody wants to be involved at this stage. But they've got to come from various distances. But what they've done is they've got lots of scouting forces in place. They've got every single ford and crossing point across the Somme covered, they think. And what they do is they force Henry inland. Now, the problem Henry's got is his troops have got 8 to 10 days rations, basically. And as you can see from the timeline here, if you're diverting down the Somme, then you're actually increasing the distance and the timelines to Calais. And what's significant here, as Drac says, he's actually marching through saying there's going to be no pillaging. And in fact, he hangs a soldier just before Agincourt for stealing a pyx across and what holds the bread and the holy bread in a church. He actually hangs him to show, look, the church, we're not going to touch the church. But what they start doing as they come down the Somme is they start living off the land. And that's a clear indication that they're in trouble because they're actually doing something they didn't do along here. As it happens, they managed to find an unguarded or unknown ford. I think the French didn't realise you could cross there near Peronne, and he manages to get across here. And by the 23rd of October, he's up here. And the French are now repositioning with their main force, because they've crossed to Amiens and coming in from other places as well, to parallel him initially. And by the 24th, they've got ahead of him. And Henry thinks about offering battle on the 24th, but he doesn't. So overnight, 24th, 25th, that's the little touch of Harry and the Night that we see in Shakespeare's Henry V. You've got a very, very starving English army. It's pouring with rain. They are probably outnumbered 2.5, 3 to 1 the following morning. But as we'll see, Henry has a plan as well.
And okay, so we'll get into Agincourt in a minute. In this process, does Henry know that? Does Henry know that he will be outnumbered?
Yes, the population difference between France and England is huge already. So he already knew that going across. And of course, when he takes his army, although it's a very large army for England, he's got to leave behind defences, he's got to leave behind enough forces to maintain order, potentially to also quell any minor uprisings.
Deal with the Scots.
Because at this point it's still England, not the United Kingdom. And he's, as we said earlier, he's got to pay for all this. So every single man who goes across is an additional cost to his coffers. So he's taking kind of the core, the cream of English fighting power, yeomen, archers, knights, men-at-arms, so forth, including my 17th or 18th great-grandfather, who's actually in this army, recorded on the Agincourt roll as a yeoman archer. Wow. Apparently a little bit of a miscreant, according to the records.
So you've gone up in the world.
Yeah, just a little bit. So he knows that if the French get their act together, they will outnumber him quite badly, which is why when he's besieging Harfleur, he wants it over quickly. And then once it becomes it's not over quickly, he's trying to get the Dauphin settled at one-on-one. He does not want to fight a full-fledged battle with the full force of France. If he has to fight them at all, he wants to fight them in small, disconnected groups, which is part of the reason why the English have allied with the Burgundians and supported the Burgundians in the past, because the Burgundians have a good chunk of the fighting power of northern France. And it's quite interesting in that the tensions between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, even at this point when you have an enemy army in your country, are so high that when the royal court is sending out the summons for troops, they're actually saying specifically to the Burgundians, look, we demand you send your men, but we also demand that you don't send your higher ranking members of your family, because then you might get glory on the battlefield that we don't want you to have. And some of them are also a little bit worried that, knowing the connection between the Burgundians and the English, they're worried that Burgundians might turn around and go, well, actually, you know what, we're going to temporarily switch sides because there's enough bad blood between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs that they might legitimately just turn on them in a deal with Henry to split France between them.
Okay, that's interesting. It kind of gives us a bit of a sense of the fractious nature of France's politics.
Having said
point.
that, two of the Duke of Burgundy's brothers are here on the French side. One of them arrives late and pays for that.
It's an interesting contrast between what today we would think of as a kind of a nationalism kind of thing of we're fighting for our country, whereas back then it was they're as much fighting for their families and their dynasties as much as they are for territory.
In fact, I always see it as two mafia families, and you've got all the sort of assassinations and all the other double dealing that you see between mafia families. It's very much the same dynamic.
Okay, all of that plays out on the battlefield at Agincourt. Let's head there now. Okay, let's dig into the battle itself then. And here we have a map of Agincourt. We have the very narrow battlefield. We have the English and the French in this face-off on this very, very sort of narrow patch of land. Drac, tell us what we're looking at here, and perhaps we should start with the English and positioning, which is absolutely key. The positioning here is really critical as to how this plays out.
So what the English have done is, as all armies at the time would have done, they've advanced in a formation with three what they call battles. So you've got the vanguard, the main battle in the middle, and the rear guard. And then when you deploy for battle, the vanguard and the rear guard become your flanks, and obviously the main battle is your centre. So we know exactly what size the English army was at this point. It's around about 6,000 people, give or take a little bit. And less than 1,000 of those are knights and men-at-arms. The vast, vast, vast majority are archers. And that dictates to a certain extent how they can deploy, because obviously you've got Henry in the middle. He's got pretty much all the English foot soldiers and knights, because you can't spread them out. There physically aren't enough of them to spread out across the entire front. So the left and right flanks are made up almost entirely of archers, with a small contingent in each flank headed by an appropriate member of the nobility. So you've got the Duke of York on the right flank, for instance, and they're essentially for command and control purposes. And the big idea that Henry's come across while he's been en route is to cut a whole bunch of big wooden stakes. And so his plan is to sit there with, let's say, archers on the flanks, most of his infantry in the middle, put a big row of stakes in front of him, and make the enemy come to him. Because every manual of war at the time basically says that if you are the one who has to advance and attack, there's a very good chance you'll lose. If you're the one who's chosen your defensive ground, there's a very good chance you'll win. Of course, the English from Crécy and Poitiers and stuff already have experience of this. And so what Henry is trying to do is create the ultimate defensive ground out of what is otherwise actually not particularly brilliant ground for either side. Complicated, of course, by the fact it's been chucking it down with rain overnight, which is adding further complications. The one problem he has is that the French nobility can read those war manuals just as well as he can. So he's positioned at one end of the battlefield, they're positioned at the other end, and they're just sitting there going, well, we can wait as long as we like, because the longer we wait, the more of our people arrive and the less food you have. And so that forces Henry, after a while of standing there staring angrily at each other, to actually start taking some initiative.
Okay, Chris, take us here then to the French setup. How does it compare?
So, I mean, you've probably got anything between 18 and 25,000 troops. There's a real dispute as about how many French were there at the time, but their plan basically is quite a good one. They are looking at Henry. They're not going to decline the challenge, but they're going to make him wait. If they have to wait out the whole day, they're going to do that, because they're going to have more and more people arriving. And in fact, quite a lot of the nobles are saying, don't start before I get there. We want to get involved in this. And what we have to realise in the French camp, there are gradations of rank. So nobody really knows who's going to take charge at any particular point. Right now, Marshal Boucicaut and the Constable of France, d'Aubray, are taking charge. But when the Duke of Alençon arrives, he outranks them. So there's all sorts of issues about who's going to take command and control here. But more than anything, a lot of the French nobles want to be in the front rank. They want to have the glory. They want to be able to do this. Now, the plan they've got is they've faced these archers before. They know about Crécy. They know about Poitiers. So they've got some cavalry here that they want to use. And they're going to ride down the archers. But the problem is they can't identify the archers. Two reasons. One is because Drac says they're interspersed with men-at-arms on both flanks. But Henry's actually put some archers here in the woods as well. And they're a bit of a problem for the cavalry. They've also got some crossbowmen who they decide not to use because they're just going to get in the way. And we've seen that before at the Battle of Crécy. So they're taken out of the way. The lord in charge of the crossbowmen, Rambarez, says, OK, I've got nothing to do. I'll join the front rank. So you've got a situation where you've got a lot of nobles all after glory. You've got all these men-at-arms here. You've got this very narrow gap here. But, yeah, we can wait all day. We've also got to wait for some of these senior people to come along. It would be really rude to start before they're here, wouldn't it? And they do. And what happens is, as you can see on the map, is Henry up sticks, he advances, and they start firing arrows into the cavalry. And the cavalry decide they don't like this very much, so they withdraw. And the French say, what's going on here? We better react to this. And what Henry does, he arrives here in this forward position. Not sure, Drac, whether he takes the stakes with him or not.
It seems likely because he is advancing to very close contact.
Yeah.
And it's in some of the accounts, there is this whole thing about a big gamble that he's taking of essentially he's advancing into a superior force. If they then countercharge, he's done. So he needs to be able to quickly re-establish this defensive position.
But the sheer act of hammering in sharpened, I just don't see it. Modern sappers would have a problem dealing with that.
That'd be tough, eh?
Banging in sharpened stakes. So, so there's an issue. So otherwise, if you turn them around and put the pointy bits in the ground, maybe, but then what's the point? So I wonder if they've got stakes at this point. So what they're doing, though, is they're starting to fire into the French.
Yes.
Now,
and that's an onslaught, isn't it? That is
not at that point.
Is it not?
I think it's flea biting at the time. But in fact, almost any medieval army, once they're subjected to longbow attacks, nearly always reacts. We get a similar situation at the Battle of Flodden. James IV of Scotland in 1513 is in a beautiful defensive position, and he's provoked to come down by being fired on by archers. So we shouldn't underestimate, actually, there's a pride thing as well. We can't just sit here. And so what happens is the French start motoring forward with this. It's very muddy, as Drac said, really muddy. And in fact, some of the French sources say these knights are up to their knees at one stage in this sort of thing. So they're slip sliding. The horses are all over the place as well in this sort of very unstable ground underfoot. And also the second battle is coming on as well. We're keen to get involved. We're keen to reinforce this. And then they basically come into contact with the English. It's then a slugfest between the men-at-arms, archers on the flanks firing into them. And in fact, as they come forward, they're being compressed into each other. Because they're keen to be, they can see where Henry's standard is, so they're making for that. And secondly, the archers on the flanks are driving them in. So they're compressed all the time between the woods and the fact they really don't like the arrows very much as they're going forward.
Right.
So by the time they get here, you have the sources saying they can barely lift their arms to fight.
And just briefly, does Henry... This is conscious from Henry. Henry knows that's going to happen, does he?
No, he doesn't.
Is it sort of a bit accidental, bit of a fluke?
No, I mean, he's compressed the battlefield. That's the key point. And if you notice, look at the woods. They're actually, I think, Drac, there's actually a conscious issue here. It's not just to provoke the French. You've actually got a better position here because you're more constrained. So your line doesn't have to go as thin as you might think. The other issue that's worth considering, anybody looking at this is going, why aren't the French doing this? Why aren't they coming around the back? Now, I think it's very interesting because you can see in some of the sources that Henry brings his baggage train up with him. And he says, as he goes forward, I'm going to bring the baggage train with me. And I think he brings the baggage train in here to actually deal with that issue in case. And in fact, as we'll see, somebody does come round later. But I think that's a defensive measure to fill that gap.
Yeah, and it's one of the other reasons potentially why he's choosing to advance, not just to force the battle to happen that day, but because the longer and longer all the cavalry sit around, the more and more likely it is that someone's going to, well, hang on a minute, if we're just hanging around, why don't we
go
just
around the back.
Start flanking?
Got it. Yeah.
So when the fighting starts, there's an initial cavalry charge on the wings. They can't flank because of the woods. They get quite badly shot up. They run back, and this complicates things even further because as the main first battle of the French forces coming forward, you've got unhorsed cavalry driven wild by being hit by arrows come charging back the other way, which is breaking up their lines, knocking people over, disorganizing their front. So by the time you've got this very compressed, very exhausted bunch of knights and men-at-arms arriving at the front lines, they've then got to fight the fresh, relaxed, albeit heavily outnumbered English. And they also find that while you've got the archers firing in on the flanks, the archers themselves also make pretty good light infantry at this point, because you've got to remember, again, contrary to popular culture, these aren't half-starved peasants who are just wearing cloth. They have some armour, not as much as the knights, but still a decent amount. They do have side weapons, falchions, axes, this kind of stuff, small shields, metal shields called bucklers. And I mean, these are guys who can draw 140, 150, 160 or heavier pound draw weight war bows. They're not weak. You can't be a half-starved peasant and draw a heavy war bow. So they're pretty strong as well. So if they start fighting, yes, they don't have the skill, they don't have the training, they don't have the protection, but they're lightweight, they're agile, and they can mob French knights and bring them down.
And that's a pain for the French knights who are dressed something akin to what you're wearing now, and they are in the mud, under fire,
falling over
in a narrow battlefield. That must be an absolute nightmare. I mean, you're getting a bit of a feel now for how difficult it is to stand in the studio.
Well, and some of the accounts talk about the French adding more armour specifically because they don't want to get shot. So one of the theories is potentially that instead of wearing what you call voiders, so small patches of mail at the weak points, that some of them may have been wearing full suits of mail under their full plate, which is making you very, very protected, but also making you very heavy and even less agile and even more exhausted. So when it comes down to it, if you're in the heat of battle, as I've been a few times, you can probably tell from the dents, it can literally be a matter of moments, especially if you've got reduced mobility.
And visibility.
And visibility between, keeping your distance and being able to fight somebody, or 2 or 3 guys just piling on top of you. And again, the sources tell us that as the first ranks of the French knights start to fall, and basically the dead and wounded start piling up and people start tripping over, the pressure from behind, from the rest of that battle, from the second battle coming in behind, you end up with literally mounds and a barrier of fallen French, which their comrades have to climb over to get at the English. And the ones at the front, who by this point are absolutely shattered, they can't climb over it to get back. Doesn't all go the English way. The Duke of York is killed in straight up combat. The English line buckles, just about manages to hold. Henry's brother, one of his brothers who's fighting alongside him, is wounded, and there's this sort of very almost cinematic moment where the French start dragging him away, and Henry plants one foot on his back and is like, "You are not taking my brother." Of course, he's wearing a golden crown, so everybody's like, "Okay, fine, you stand there, we'll attack you." And it gives you some idea of just how martial a king Henry is, in that pretty much every Frenchman in a 50-yard radius is gunning for him, and him and his bodyguard are fighting for their lives and for their crown and for the future of their country, with Henry not even really being able to move more than a few feet in any given direction to keep his brother safe. And gradually, as the battle goes on, the English line stabilizes, the longbowmen who are too close to shoot start getting involved, the longbowmen who can shoot keep shooting, and very gradually the French momentum starts to run out, and then they start to break, and then it looks like perhaps after quite a bit of heavy fighting that perhaps the battle might be won. But then everyone realizes, hang on a minute, the French rearguard, the third battle, hasn't done anything yet.
And you've also got a problem. I mean, the interesting thing about this battlefield is that if you're looking at it from the French point of view, Henry's in a trap here as well. He can't go either way, and he's trapped around the back here. So you just have to get, as we said, something around the back here. Nobody thinks about that except for the local Lord of Agincourt, who says, "I'm going to go around the back." And he takes a motley crew around the back. And I think there's also some local people who are getting interested in some of the spoils here. They start killing everybody in the English camp. And the sources, again, don't really make it definitive. But what happens then is, because Henry thinks he's got an attack in the rear here, he says, we really can't afford to hold all these sort of prisoners that we've got. So he orders them to be killed, except for the high nobility and those he thinks will get good ransoms.
Is that because he's worried about them joining?
As Drax says, he's worried about these here, and we think, I mean, it's the Anthony of Brabant thing, isn't it? Essentially, there's a sort of cheer when another French noble arrives, and the English think, hang on, the third battle's going to attack us. We've got this problem in the rear here, and we're holding about probably 1,500 prisoners here. And also, of course, all the English are thinking, great, I've just made my fortune here. So they're paying attention to their prisoners. And so Henry says, look, we're going to kill all the prisoners who aren't worth a lot of ransom. And everybody says, we're not sure we want to do that in the middle of a battle. And he gets 200 archers to do it, people who are not so fussy about doing this sort of thing, and kills all the prisoners who are not really worth saving.
Okay.
And we've got to realise what's going on here. The French think they're entering a battle here. If you're a noble, okay, you're going to get ransomed. You're not going to get killed, okay? The English are in the killing business here. They can't afford to be too choosy about who they're capturing. But if they recognise somebody who's well off, they're going to ransom him.
So this feels to me really, then, Drac, just finally, to be, if we were going to make a call between this being French incompetence and English strategic brilliance or whatever, it's probably the balance of favour towards English strategic, if not brilliance, at least they were smart.
The English have put themselves in the best position they can do for this battle, even though obviously there's still massive odds stacked against them. And what kind of tips it just over the edge is realistic is the fact that Dauphin isn't there, because Marshal Boucicaut is one of the most experienced and capable soldiers in all of France. The one problem is he doesn't have a high hereditary title, and that is kind of the root cause, because if the Dauphin had been there as essentially their equivalent of the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, he could say, look, we're all going to listen to Marshal Boucicaut and do what he says, and that would improve...
Or the constable,
Or the constable, and that would improve order hugely. But with the situation as it is, you have lots of nobles who are of a higher social status, but not necessarily anywhere close to as good a military commander. And they're all competing. Why should I listen to Boucicaut? He's lowborn. I should do what I want glory for me. And that introduces just enough disorder into the French ranks to allow the English to get their victory. And actually that last bit, when we have the execution of the prisoners, if you put yourself in a bit of a mind of a football crowd, so you think about a modern day football match, players go on, the supporters chant their names, very similar back in those days. And as Dr. Parry indicated, one of the big theories is that the commander, or one of the main commanders of the third battle, the rear guard of the French, is a guy whose surname is de Brabant because he is from the region of Brabant. The English know this. The problem is, even during the battle, more French troops have been showing up. And one of those contingents is led by the Count of Brabant, who's rocked up riding really fast. He's not wearing full armour, grabs some stuff off of a squire so he can get into battle. And of course, when people are arriving, people are sort of cheering for them. And so one of the theories is that the English are hearing this cry of Brabant, Brabant, Brabant from the French lines. What they're actually hearing is everyone going, hey, the Count of Brabant is here, this is fantastic. But what they think they're hearing is the rearguard psyching themselves up by chanting their commander's name, and they're about to attack. Right. When in fact they're looking at what's happened to the first and second battles and being like, you go first. And so actually the Count of Brabant does attack. It goes horribly badly for him, as you might expect, and the battle then just kind of peters out, and what's left of the French army retreats. The heralds on both sides meet up and like, yep, it's very clear the English have won. And you get this wonderful scene in Shakespeare, which loads of people have heard from various different franchises and so forth. It's like, cry havoc, let loose the dogs of war. And what that actually means is back then, havoc was a cry that basically meant to the loot, go and loot things. And that's kind of, okay, the battle is over. Now let's go and steal everything that isn't bolted down, including people, for ransom.
Okay. I mean, this quite a lot of killing goes on at this point. I mean, all the injured French get killed basically, axes to the faces and things like that. And Anthony of Brabant, who's turned up not looking like a noble, gets mistaken for somebody who's not a very high regard. So he gets killed at that point. He's injured, but then gets finished off. And you get a situation here where the French basically, as Drac says, just melt away. They can't be interested in this. But let's just emphasize one thing. This is a perennial military issue, unity of command. This is what we're talking about. Everybody knows who's in charge on this side, and everybody knows what's going to happen. With this constant bickering and sort of one-upmanship on this side, nobody knows who's in charge. Is it the Count of Vendôme, who's actually quite experienced? Is it the Duke of Alençon? Oh, it might be him. And I think this is the problem at Agincourt, is the French cannot agree who's in charge and who's directing this battle.
Okay, so Henry V wins out. There is a treaty. There is an heir. There is a dual crown held for a while. Do you want to just give us a very quick potted history of what comes next before we undo it?
So Henry goes back to Calais. He arrives back in England. Everybody's very happy. We're very happy with the Lancastrians now on the throne. You know, he's just won the World Cup for us almost. Lots of ransoms, of course, makes him very sort of popular. There are a series of expeditions now into Normandy to capture Normandy itself. There's one under Thomas of Clarence, which is his next eldest brother, goes to Harfleur to reinforce that. And then it's a progressive move through Normandy. And Henry's the consummate siege master. So all that's happening. We get to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. And essentially the deal is Charles VI of France can continue as king, but afterwards Henry becomes king. And he marries the king's daughter, Catherine. That goes slightly wrong because at the Siege of Meaux, as the campaign continues against the French, Henry gets some dysenteric disease and dies. And he has a son, Henry VI, who is months old, who then, when his grandfather dies, becomes King of France and Britain. And then the whole story up until 1453 then is can the English actually conquer enough of France to maintain that, or can the French make a comeback? There's a series of battles, series of sieges. There's Joan of Arc, and the bottom line is the English get thrown out of France everywhere except Calais from 1453 onwards.
But it takes the other half of the 100 Years' War, because at this point, Agincourt is it's the beginning of the end of the first half. So when you've got this whole situation of Henry's going to inherit the crown, his son's going to be the king of both kingdoms. At that point, it looks like, okay, it's actually the 50 Years' War and the English have won. And then there's this pause, and then the second half, and that's when it all goes horribly wrong for the Kingdom of England.
I mean, without Henry V, they can't conquer the rest of France, so there's quite a significant amount left, and that allows the French to come back, and as I said, basically capture everything except Calais by 1453.
Okay, that's the real history then of what happened at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Now let's do what we love to do on History Undone and undo it. Okay, let's get to what we love doing here on History Undone and ask ourselves some of those really long-term questions. Had the Battle of Agincourt been won by the French? Drac, what constitutes a French victory here?
Right, so if the English can withdraw in good order, maintain the core of their army, given the odds, that's still not going to be seen as a totally crushing victory. So we really need to have a scenario where the French win decisively, which is possible with a few minor changes. So, for example, if it hadn't rained quite as much as it did that night before, it's still going to be muddy, but it's not going to be the knee-deep mud that they end up experiencing. Another thing is, as we discussed, the complete confusion in the French chain of command. So if we were to hypothesize that maybe it's not rained on the night before the battle, and the French commanders have a bit of a discussion, and they decide, okay, instead of everybody piling in at the front, even if most people pile in at the front, some of them are still going to hang back with the second and the third battles to supervise. And so when that initial attack comes in, the cavalry first and then the first battle, they are coming in a little bit faster, a little bit less tired because the ground is not quite as soft. And then as that first attack falters, which it probably still is going to, then the second battle, instead of piling into the back of the first battle and crushing them, are instead coming in at a regulated pace. As the first battle falls back, the second battle piles in, keeps the pressure up, so the English are having to fight another whole engagement, and the third battle does the same thing. So if the second battle falters, which it probably won't, that'll probably be enough, but even if it does, you've got relief from the third. So it's just constant mass piling the pressure on the limited English numbers. There's a few hundred, 600 to 800 English knights. There's no way they can fight that many Frenchmen all day.
They're only 4 deep as well.
Yeah.
That's the key thing.
And Henry, as we say, is confined by having to defend his brother. At some point, he's just going to get overwhelmed by fatigue. And then the French would dearly love to capture him, but he said, no, but this is all or nothing. So he's probably cut down. And at that point, the English army is going to be shattered. They're going to be shattered morale-wise, shattered physically. Their king's gone. The Duke of York historically died on the right flank anyway. So at that point, the English army starts to break. As soon as the English army starts to break, any reinforcements that are coming in, like the Count of Brabant or any mounted forces in the third battle, are going to run them down, which classic medieval battle ending. And at that point, the bulk of the English army is either dead or captured, and there's no one to come back to Calais.
And so that makes Calais vulnerable, Chris? Does it?
Yeah, I think you've got a large army operating here in northern France. I think the temptation to go and besiege Calais at this point is very great. I mean, I think the other thing is, you've got most of your nobles captured as well. That means ransoms. That means you're going to probably sort of impoverish Britain, England as a result of that. If the king gets captured, massive ransom. If you look at Richard the Lionheart when he was ransomed, in fact, one of the issues that Henry went to France with in the first place was to get some of the money that they should have paid for capturing King John of France at the Battle of Poitiers, which they hadn't paid up by that stage. So all that sort of thing is going to affect the economy of England quite severely, to tell you the truth. At the same time, you've got, most of the families in England saying, well, we've either got our fathers ransomed, our brothers needing to be ransomed, or they're dead. So you've got lots of succession crises going on here. Now, in terms of what's happening in England, Henry's been totally delegitimised, and so is his dynasty at this point, because God has actually spoken on the battlefield. And so what you've got in England right now, Henry has three brothers. He's got his youngest brother, Humphrey, with him. He's the guy who got injured. There are two others. One's Thomas of Clarence. He's gone home from Harfleur. He was either injured or had dysentery. And there's also John, Duke of Bedford. Both are very capable. So you'd expect them to hold the line in Britain at the time. Thomas of Clarence is the eldest, so he would obviously be the heir apparent. So we'd have a King Thomas, oddly enough. And John, Duke of Bedford, really proves himself as the regent of France afterwards, is very capable as well. So you'd expect the dynasty to hold together, to tell the truth. But there's another issue. There's a chap called Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March. He was Richard II's heir presumptive. And he possibly is a contender to say, actually, I'm descended from the second son of Edward III, Lionel of Clarence. You're only descended from the third son. So I think I have a right here to actually stake a claim to the throne. So you could have ended up in a situation where you have a dynastic conflict coming through. Having said that, Edmund Mortimer has been really loyal all the way through the Lancastrian period, but he was the subject of the plot against Henry V at Porchester and Southampton just before they sailed. And in fact, he's married to the sister of the chief conspirator, Richard, Earl of Cambridge, who gets executed, but is the father of Richard, Duke of York, who of course appears later in the Wars of the Roses. So you can see how the dynastic thing plays here. So you've got an impoverished kingdom, you've got a dynasty that has been delegitimised by what's happened on the continent, and you have a possible superior contender to the throne who said, well, I'm not involved in this, because he went across to Harfleur, and like Thomas of Clarence, he had to go back because he had dysentery as well. So he's actually there. So if you're Thomas, the first thing you're going to do is get hold of him.
Yeah, okay. We'll come back to that in a minute, and how it might influence, because the War of the Roses to consider, isn't there? Just in terms of France, and as far as France is concerned, Armagnac's very much emboldened, presumably, by this victory.
Yeah, which might also cause the fall of Calais, because if the Armagnacs have had a massive boost through wiping out the English army, the Burgundians, whose main territory is kind of over this way, they might think, okay, the only way we can claw back some of this is we need to do something, and something is go after Calais before the main army at Agincourt can reorganise and get there.
So there's a race for Calais then at that point,
basically. So the Armagnac cause is hugely strengthened. The Dauphin will obviously then become king when his father dies. And because there are still some English holdings elsewhere, but now with the main force of the English army crushed, and internal dissent in England, it also gives them a great opportunity to hoover up all the rest of the English-held territory.
In Aquitaine.
Far in advance of what happens historically. So France as a kingdom is probably much more united, much more in line with what we'd think of today as the country of France than it would be for 50, 60, 70 years after this historically. So that puts France in a much stronger position to command the continent. And it also isolates England from continental politics a lot more because it's, as Dr. Berry said, it's been judged on the battlefield, very religious society that's been judged by God as their claim was inferior. And now not only have they got to contend with all the ransoms, but as we said right at the beginning, Henry's basically mortgaged the kingdom. Everybody's loaned him money. So if this campaign has collapsed, all that money's gone as well, whereas obviously historically they got it back. So that England's now in a very, very difficult state. And as we know, as soon as the financial state of a country goes downhill, that's when you start to see fractions and divisions and potentially internal conflict.
And just quickly again on France. I mean, does this give way to a French empire of sorts? Chris?
No, I think Drac's right. They consolidate basically the land territory of the Franks, as they call it. It's not so much France; it's the people of France, and they take Aquitaine and things like that. What's quite interesting about this is you won't see a change in French behaviours militarily if they win this. What you see after the loss at Agincourt is they start saying, right, how are we going to deal with this in future? And they have another go at the English in 1424 at the Battle of Verneuil, and they actually employed 2,000 Milanese cavalry. And they think they've got the best armour in the world. We'll sort out this cavalry business and how we're going to do it. And initially they do quite well before being annihilated. Interestingly, the general is John, Duke of Bedford, so showing he's doing really well. But then we get to down onto the Loire later when the English are sort of pushing down there. The French get a handle on this and they use their cavalry really well in the flanks, and they totally destroy an English army at Patay in 1429. And so you can see by winning, they've actually altered the way the thing. At a time when infantry is actually getting in the ascendant, what confirms the fact that they need to change is the fact they lose at Agincourt. So you think if they hadn't, they'd have continued in the same old way and might have been vulnerable to some fairly famous sort of infantry in the Low Countries and even the Germans as well. So they don't actually change if they don't lose at Agincourt. And I think that's actually quite significant.
You learn your lessons in defeats, don't you? Sometimes those are the most helpful moments in
The other interesting thing is that my own hunch is if you're English, you start to lose interest in France at this point after Agincourt. And about mid-century, there's a very interesting book called The Libel of English Policy. And basically it says, you know what, we shouldn't be involved on the continent. We're losing at that point, by the way. It says we should be on the sea. And it's the first real treatise where England starts to say, we're an island, we should start concentrating on the sea, not on the continent. And it's really quite interesting, the change in attitude as a result of that. So had that come earlier, then we might have been out at sea, maybe even cooperating with our allies, the Portuguese, who are related to the English royal family, and doing more on the Atlantic seaboard instead of actually being involved on the continent.
Because historically, English attention to the wider world, if you like, really only kicks off in the middle of the Tudor period, because even Henry VIII is still trying to recapture that glory of Agincourt and doing campaigns in France. And it's only really with Elizabeth's time that the English perspective starts to shift to, okay, Europe can be Europe, we're going to go and try and take most of the rest of it. Whereas in this case, once the internal struggles are over, and it's not just political, it could also be religious, because obviously it's a very religious society. You've got the Lollards in England who are something of a force. They might see a resurgence, and there's sort of a whole, we clearly weren't pure enough and holy enough and all this kind of thing. Once all that settles down, if England is now almost divorced from continental politics, there's nothing left holding them to that, but they need to expand somewhere commercially, potentially territorially.
The Baltic, or down the Atlantic coast. And what's really interesting is the Lancastrian kings build up a significant navy. This decays by the end of the sort of 1440s, 1450s. But in the River Hamble, for example, in Hampshire, you've got about 6 or 7 really big warships that the Lancastrian kings actually bring to bear. So my own hunch is that England would have gone maritime pretty much earlier.
Because if you wind forward almost a century, you have this chap that everyone's probably heard of called Christopher Columbus. He's shopping around for a sponsor for his expedition, and eventually he settles on the Spanish, as we know historically. He didn't really care. He wasn't going across the Atlantic for the glory of Spain or the glory of whoever. He was going over the Atlantic with the glory of Christopher Columbus. And whoever happened to pay him.
And he thought he was going to India.
And he did, in fact, make a visit to the English court at one point, who weren't particularly interested. But in this scenario, yes, okay, it's a century down the line, a lot can happen in between. But it's entirely possible that a much more maritime-looking England in the late 1400s goes, you know what, actually, yeah, let's see what's out there. Let's see if we can get better trade routes and so forth.
Does that change a lot?
No, I think it happens earlier.
Yeah.
That's the point. If you've lost interest in France, my own hunch is you go down towards Portugal and down the African coast initially, because as I said, we've got a dynastic link there. What will slightly stymie that is you don't have Aquitaine anymore, so there's that. But I think it brings as I said, with the libel of English policy, this little propaganda document in the middle of the century, it's actually saying, look, forget the continent. We need to be out there. And I think you start in the Baltic. I think that's where you get quite a lot of your supplies from. You're possibly still continuing the wine trade with Aquitaine. You're down the coast. And as Drac says, it's very possible that once this Genoese comes across and says, I've got this plan, you might be interested. And you might have the technology and also the know-how to actually say, well, that's actually quite a good option.
Because you've got to remember that when the Spanish went and took over Central and South America, the Aztecs and the Incas, this wasn't Spain flexing its massive military muscle. This was a few hundred people who the Spanish didn't particularly like very much and were basically throwing over there on the grounds of, if you win glory, great. If you die, we don't care. Right. And, even though England's a much smaller country, it can easily afford a few hundred men. So
that would have changed something then, because that would have changed the footprint of that.
Well, you think about how much money the Spanish made off of their Central and South American domains over the next few hundred years. Obviously, England built up the 13 colonies, but let's face it, they were never sending back anywhere near the same amount of cash. So weirdly, you could end up in a situation where, if things play out down a very narrow line, England ends up being in the position of receiving the kind of money that Imperial Spain did, which then, if you look for sort of the political precedent in the 19th century, where England is essentially just looking entirely outside the continent, and the continental powers are arguing amongst themselves. So you could end up with a situation 2 centuries down the line where England is very happily building a massive overseas empire and raking the money in, with everyone else nipping at their trade lanes. Meanwhile, France is sitting as kind of a continental hegemon and fighting off various German city-states and the Spanish and trying to essentially replace the Holy Roman Empire. And they kind of occasionally glare at each other across the channel, but don't really care what the other is doing as long as it doesn't impinge on them.
But there's another issue as well. If you're hostile with France, okay, and you look down here, you're going to start getting into bed with Spain and Portugal anyway. So if you look at what happened during the first half of the 100 Years' War, you see Henry's grandfather, John of Gaunt, heavily engaged in Spain, actually going after one of the Spanish crowns. So that may develop as well. So what Drac says might actually work out as a partnership between Spain and Portugal and England pushing to the west. And then that totally alters the complexion of what's happening across in the Americas.
And just in a sort of emboldened, less sort of fractured France, does a Joan of Arc character emerge?
There's no need.
No.
Because Joan of Arc emerges as a figurehead when the French are really struggling to figure out what on earth they should do to kick the English out.
And she appears at Orleans just before the Battle of Patay, in fact.
Yeah. And in this scenario, the French have already kicked the English out, and they're sitting there going, well, clearly our methods work. So we don't need a figurehead because we've already got one. Whoever is the leader of that final victorious charge at Agincourt.
And just very, very briefly, but the War of the Roses happens earlier. You think it still plays out?
No, it depends. It depends the grip that Thomas of Clarence, who is now King Thomas, of course, and his brother John have on the kingdom afterwards. It's obviously in turmoil. As I said, there's a lot of settlement of successions and things like that. It's impoverished. I think they probably assert control over it, and you see the Lancastrian dynasty continuing. I mean, at the end of the day, Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, has got a great claim to the throne. No question about it. He was the heir apparent. I doubt, Drac, if he could actually muster the forces, although he's very strong in the Welsh marches, where, as you know, the Lollards are very strong. So you could... But, the Pope's going to intervene at some stage and say, I'll give legitimacy to whichever king suppresses these heretics. So I suspect, the Lancastrians...
I think it's going to depend a lot on who's lost the most troops at Agincourt. Because if the Duke of Clarence, now king, is able to solidify control and he's got some of the few troops left in England, there's not really much anyone can do to challenge him. If, on the other hand, it turns out that a good chunk of the troops that are left, perhaps the troops left at the Scottish borders and stuff,
Percy's.
if they throw their weight behind Mortimer, or maybe even
of course they did. Under Henry IV.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if they're like, actually, you know what, maybe a bit of changes in order, there might not be much of a resistance.
Yeah. Okay. So notwithstanding what the French learnt in defeat there, and how that may change the course of their history, we're talking perhaps about a very different psyche, certainly a very different outlook, military outlook for the English, and a very different France emerges too. And it's incredible to think, really, Chris, that this is a single day of history we're talking about here. This is one single day of history.
But so many battles and instances are that actually change the course of history. I mean, I think what's interesting about Agincourt is the way the echoes, happen down the centuries. I mean, as Drac has already alluded to, Henry VIII can't get Henry V out of his mind. He goes back in specifically to try and provoke another Agincourt. He gets the Battle of the Spurs, which is not quite the same, but he goes back in and tries the same. And it's until we actually finally get kicked out of Calais that this sort of echo disappears. But then, of course, Shakespeare picks it up, and it is the quintessential. I mean, until the film Zulu is filmed, it is the quintessential battle film for the English, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you get a situation where you hear that down the centuries, and we happy few, we band of brothers is picked up by Nelson, who calls his captains his band of brothers. So yet another day in history, in English history, of course, the Battle of Trafalgar, which changes everything. So the myths and all the associations with things like this echo down the centuries. They become part of the national legend. And they become part of the morale, if you like, of the English people.
Okay. So at the very least, then, we'd have perhaps one less Shakespeare text, wouldn't we, I guess?
And maybe not Richard III either.
And maybe Richard III either, yes. That's a whole...
And in fact, neither the three parts of Henry VI. So there we go.
These are pebbles in the pond we don't have the time for at the moment. But yes, very interesting. That's what we've got time for on this episode of History Undone. My thanks to Drac. It's been a real pleasure to have you. Thank you so much in your brilliant suit of armour, looking fantastic. Thanks as ever to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me as well. We'll be back undoing more history very soon. In the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History, on YouTube. You can also listen to this wherever you get your podcasts as well. So if you're out and about, just search for History Undone in your podcast app, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.